Fail fast and fail forward. If, like me, you come from a tech and innovation background, it's a concept you're familiar with. Having said that, failure sometimes sound like a dirty word, something that we are ashamed of. It can be difficult to admit when you failed your company, your startup, your people. Well, even investors invest knowing that a lot of the startup on their portfolio will fail, whilst those that succeed will make them millions. Welcome to the Mary Poppins of Startups live show. I'm Nalima Kangu from Athena Leaders. As a tech consultant and startup advisor, I will answer live the burning question that you have on your way to Series A+. Subscribe and tune in every week to meet amazing guests, startup founders, investors, and more. More importantly, relax and enjoy the show. In this episode, we'll talk to an amazing guest who's putting a refreshingly positive spin on failure, leaving his audience with many tips and tricks and tools they can easily introduce into their everyday lives. Meet Paul Padmore, the founder and creator of the podcast My Perfect Failure, the podcast that believes our failures are a vital ingredient for our future success, and I believe that too. Paul speaks to experts on the subject and those who reveal how their failures have been critical to their success. When Paul is not podcasting, he works as a behavioral strategy consultancy as the head of customer engagement. Paul, welcome to the show. It's been a while since we've been discussing this, and I'm really, really excited to dive deeper in not just what you do with the podcast, but this topic and this idea of failure. But before we go way deep into this, could you please introduce yourself for our guests?
Well, thank you so much, and I love the music as you intro into your lovely introduction. It definitely gets you going, gets you motivated. Yeah. So
Thank
yeah.
you.
Thank you for your lovely introduction. So my name is Paul Padmore. I'm the host of the podcast My Perfect Failure, which is great fun. I've been doing it for probably about just over 3 years in terms of putting out content, but the idea for the podcast was probably getting on for probably about 5 years. So there was a bit of procrastination before I had probably had a little bit of imposter syndrome about putting out content because I didn't consider myself a podcaster. So it took about a year and a half for me to muster up the confidence to put out content and actually formalize the theory of my perfect failure.
This is interesting you mentioned imposter syndrome. This is definitely something that we are going to get into a little bit
Mm,
more to kind of help startup founders and entrepreneurs and anybody out there
mm,
actually that have a bank of ideas that they're
mm,
sitting on and are really worried about putting it out there. But first, let's look at failure when we talk a little bit more about startups. As I've said in the introduction, being in a startup is a world that has a lot of
mm.
ups and downs. It's very rewarding, yet sometimes the lows can be very low. And unfortunately, failure is something that we see a lot, even if you
Mm.
have brilliant entrepreneur, a brilliant team, but things doesn't always go according to plans. Is there anything that you've experienced from in your
Yeah,
past when it comes to startups and failure?
yeah, certainly. So I think you're right in terms of, particularly in the start. I think in any sphere of life, failure is something that we can think about, or we can think that we failed, depending on how we sort of interpret that or what spin we have on that. But I think particularly in startup land, I think you're spinning so many plates, and it can be a real challenge to understand how to spin those plates and how to juggle not just yourself but all the various tasks that you have to do. I've got a background in digital advertising, predominantly for probably about 15 years. Then I've experienced working in a startup. I've experienced the ups, the downs, and it kind of really what led me to think about the idea of putting a podcast out there, because I think, for anybody, you know, watching or listening that's potentially does work in a startup or has worked in a startup, that it's incredibly stressful, lots of different emotions going on. And you really have to be quite resilient to withstand the different emotions that you've got going on. And I think also, when you fail or when you perceive you failed, how do you process that? Is that the nail in your coffin, or is it
Mhm.
something where you can actually use that experience to reposition the new information you didn't have before, you've now got, and actually that can be the seed of a new opportunity within your business, or it can be something that you use to actually, signal the end. And I prefer to use it as a seed, as additional information, or for a new opportunity.
In fact, when we first met and started talking about coming on a podcast, one thing that I loved about the way you described failure, you talked about failure being almost like a process or an opportunity to find some more information.
Mm,
Can you please share that a bit more with the audience? Because I don't want to be the only one who had the chance to overhearing the description of failure and how we can really turn that on its head.
yeah. So on the podcast, I get to, as you alluded to, I get to speak to so many amazing people from literally all over the world, and they've all got their own um, piece of expertise, and they've all have this unique ability to process those difficult moments. If you want to call it failure, because of the connotation, I don't even like the word really, because it, like you say, it has a stain to it, which it shouldn't have. It should have, an opportunity to learn. So, so it's almost like that ability to reframe the situation. So, I think when the way that I think people can and should, look at, a perceived failure is actually you've got a new opportunity, you've got information that you didn't have before. If you look at your competitors have this information that you have now, and you've had it as a result of something not going according to plan. So you really, so my um, vantage point on it would be to reposition where you were and where you are now as a new opportunity. Napoleon Hill famously, I think it's one of he's got lots of quotes, but one of his quotes is around that idea of failure as being the seed of, the failure is a seed of a new opportunity. And, if it's good enough for Napoleon Hill, it's good enough for me.
That's for sure. And in fact, whenever, I've done a lot of shows on this podcast,
Mm,
and we talked a lot about this idea of even pivoting, especially when you're startup, when
yeah,
you are going in
yeah,
troubles. This
mm,
is something that we see a lot. And again, when it comes to reframing failure and turning that as a seed of opportunities, whether it was during the pandemic, whether it was due to whatever situation, not finding the product market fit, one great way of learning from failure is about asking yourself, what do we do with this information, right? As you've
mm,
mentioned,
yeah,
where do we go next? And the ability to pivot or to learn and do
mm,
something else based on what have potentially failed or possibly
mm,
failed is
mm,
something that is not that makes you stronger. But going back again to the experience of when you were working at the startup and
yeah,
things didn't really go according to plan,
mm,
one of the things that, it's very easy for us to say, failure is part of life. We need to accept failure, we need to embrace it. But at the same time, there are very deep, sad feeling of sadness and loss when
mm,
you put your sweat and blood and tears into a venture and
mm.
that doesn't turn according to plan. So how did you personally navigate the situation, working so closely with a few people for a long period of time and trying to get to the end of
Mm,
that? So how did you navigate that and kind of turn it around?
mm. Well, I think you look at what you process it. We're all normal human beings, so you know when negative things happen, there's going to be that feeling of loss, and maybe not of loss, but of sadness. Loss is potentially a lot deeper than the job situation. Um, but then I think once you've had time to process, events, I think you're able to look at what you've learned. You look at the journey. You look at actually from start, from position A to position B, all of that new knowledge that I didn't have, that I do have. And then you look at all the amazing people, we talk about them, we know about the noted people like Thomas Edison, like J.K. Rowling, Oprah Winfrey, Mark Cuban, I could go Elon Musk, the wealthiest man in the world. So the list goes on and on and on. And when you get inspired by these people, because these people, they have a vision, and the vision is the focal point. And in order to get to that vision, these people are going to fail on, if you want to use that word, on any number of occasions. And there are lots of people, out there that are not noted because they're not on Forbes magazine, or they're not on CNN, or they're not noted. But there are lots of people out there that are doing exactly what these guys are doing, but just on a lot lower scale. So I'm inspired by those types of individuals.
It's interesting you've mentioned vision, as if we can
Mm,
stay with vision for a little bit. For me personally, I also believe that it's really good to have a vision and a goal that might not feel achievable, as it helps you and bring you up.
mm,
Yet at the same time, there are people out there who believe that having a vision and having those kind of goals that are out there stops you from enjoying the moment, or actually makes you feel like you're always a failure because you never actually achieve your goals. So
mm.
what do you think about that?
Um, well, I think it's good to have a vision, and I think your vision can change. It doesn't always have to stay the same, because you get different pieces of information that may sort of alter your vision. But I would hazard a guess. I haven't done any sort of long term research on this, but I think a lot of the people that potentially we admire, whether they be a business person, an actor, an author, a musician, whatever it may be, I think if we do a deep dive, I think most of these guys do have a vision. So I think that if we have a goal or a desire, then I think if you have a vision, I think there's a greater opportunity for us to achieve that and excel. If you don't have a vision, then it's difficult to kind of like steer our ship in the direction we want to go to. And so that would be sort of my take on vision. I do think it's important.
One of the way I look into that as well is, I think, is a quote from Stephen Covey, who said that it's really good. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, of course,
Mm,
but it's if you don't know which ladder, on which wall you're putting a ladder, which wall you're putting a ladder, you're gonna climb the ladder and realize that you probably climbed the wrong building. And that's why it's important to have a vision. And even when I work with teams, one of the things that I'd love to emphasize, which again is always contentious for people
mm,
who've never heard of OKRs or goal setting for a team,
mm,
when you put some kind of goals and objectives that are a little bit out there, there is this feeling of what is the point of even going through the
yeah,
journey if we're not going to make it. Whereas
yeah,
what we are discussing today is that, well, the journey on its own is as important as reaching the destination, because whilst you're going to the journey, you actually learn a lot. And if you do fail, then it's a useful source of information, as Paul, as you said earlier now. One thing that I would love to also share with our audience, especially that, in your podcast, you talk a
mm,
lot about failure and how to spin it around. What are some kind of tips and tricks, things that you physically do, whether it's writing or mindfulness or anything like that, to keep you
mm,
going when you see the seed of failure, whether it's a failure for a big goal or for a small
mm.
goal?
Yeah. Well, something that comes up a lot on the podcast is reframing. So that ability to you can do this yourself, where you can have something that happens, and we can think about, well, how can I reframe that as something that where I can take something positive out of that. I had a guy, amazing guy, that came on a podcast. I think it's Dr. Benjamin Hardy, and he talks about gap in the gain. So when something negative, say if we have a presentation, we do a presentation to a client, and potentially it doesn't go exactly the way that we wanted it to go to. What he talks about is, there's always a gain somewhere. The gain might be that it was the first time that we presented to this particular client. So we've got some face time in front of this client. It didn't hit, maybe the 10 that we wanted. Maybe we got a 7, but the important piece is to lean into what once the meeting is over. Maybe you think, well, not quite what I wanted, but actually there are some gains there. And also, if you can recognize the areas where it didn't go well, actually that's a positive, because now you've got this new information about things that you can work on for the next presentation. So so there was always gain there. We shouldn't always focus on the gap, which is maybe the things that don't go according to plan. And another point, that there's a lot that comes up on the podcast in terms of tools, but something that comes up quite a lot is positive self-talk. So sometimes you might not have a coach or a mentor with you, but sometimes you can coach yourself on occasions. You can say, well, I can do this, I've done it before, or other people have done this, why can't I do this? So you can sort of steel yourself. And of course a lot of people journal. So writing is a good way to cognitively engage ourselves and make ourselves more focused on what we're looking to achieve.
Writing has been one of my secret tools that I've
Really?
used for many, many years.
Yeah.
It's obviously evolved into journaling for day to
Mm.
day, but initially it's been kind of like the things that I can't quite say because I don't even know how I'm feeling about something. Whenever I felt like processing feelings and information, whether in the sense of failure or maybe an opportunity comes my way and it feels too big for me, but I also know I'm ready. Or maybe I feel a bit lost. I believe that writing has been my way of kind of, connecting with my subconscious and connecting with my inner child and my inner self. And I can be completely honest because there's no facade. There's no trying to keep going. It's about just really discovering what is inside of me that makes me vibrate negatively and try to kind of overcome that. So yes,
Yeah.
I think, for someone who's never tried journaling or writing, especially to overcome failure, then that's a really good tool.
Yeah, I think writing is a good tool. I don't journal. I do journal a bit, but I'm not consistent with it. There are people that I know that do it daily, and they totally swear by it.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting because when I first started journaling, I used to do it only when I felt disconnected,
Yeah.
right? So when I felt like I'm not quite right. So it could be
Mm.
maybe once every couple of weeks, a month, or whatever it is. But then I realized that my journals were always negative. And that's
Yeah.
because every time I looked at them and every time I picked up my journal, it felt like everything that was ever written there was bad. But
Mm.
when you look at my life, I'm like, my life is not that bad.
Yeah.
It's quite enjoyable. So over the last few years, I shifted, and this is why I journal a bit more. So sometimes I will do write a lot, sometimes less, but I try to do it a bit consistently so that when I pick up my journal, it doesn't feel like this hot plate that I go to when things are wrong, but it
Yeah.
also gives me a bit of positive memories and encourage me to keep going. Because at the end of the day, although it's good to kind of express and let go of the negative, one thing I believe is really good to overcome failure and difficult situations is also remind yourself of past situations where you
Mm.
thought you failed and where you told that things
Yeah.
didn't go according to plan.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think occasionally, I think when we do think things have gone wrong, so there's lots of examples of when things have gone wrong and they've turned out to be, actually quite positive. When you're able to think about that, that's one of the points that I've got from the podcast is that, I have experts and so forth on the podcast. I also have, people that are normal people that have gone through quite difficult situations. But when you compare to where they are now, they actually potentially, in a lot of the cases, wouldn't be where they are now if they hadn't gone through these difficult moments. And where they are now, in fabulous places where they're doing things that potentially weren't even the point of focus when they experienced that, the failure or that difficult moment.
Yeah. Earlier in this episode, you talked about imposter syndrome as a blocker that kind of slow you down a bit when you first starting to get into podcasting. You didn't believe that you could be a podcaster. And, of course, anyone joining this and wondering what the hell is that, then I will suggest that you go back and watch the beginning on YouTube. And please do take the opportunity to share this episode with your friends, especially startup founders and entrepreneurs out there who needs to kind of a bit of support and love because, the journey and the road is quite hard.
Yeah.
When we look at imposter syndrome and your journey, so can you please share with us a little bit more where you were and how you kind of transition out of that, where you are today?
Well, I think when I decided that I wanted to do something around the subject, and I thought to myself, well, what medium should I look at? And I love listening to podcasts. An ex-colleague of mine got me into podcasts, and he probably doesn't even know this. A guy called Jamie, I probably won't say his surname, but Jamie, an ex-work colleague, got me into listening to podcasts, and I just found myself a firm fan of, the content. So I wanted to do something on the subject, and then I thought I'd go for podcasting. So I didn't know how to podcast, but you can go on YouTube as most people do, and you can learn. And then it was like, well, no one's going to want to listen to my content because most people listen to, I like listening to people like Tom Bellew or, Tim Ferriss and those guys. So you listen. So the first mistake is you shouldn't judge yourself against anybody. I think when you judge yourself against anybody, particularly, elite people, it creates probably, even greater imposter syndrome. So that existed. But I think why I was able to deal with it was because when I started to connect to people, so I had the idea, created a website, did all the artwork. So I kind of like got myself all the way down the funnel in terms of being able to actually put out content, but I had no guests. So then I started to connect, speculatively reach out to potential guests, and then they started coming back saying, yeah, we want to do it. We love the idea. We'd love to be a guest on your podcast. And then at that point, the imposter syndrome kicked in because it became real. But then, you kind of have to do it because it's almost like a professional contract. To me, as soon as they say yes, it's like somebody signing like a contractual agreement, whether it be verbal or whether it be, a fax agreement or a DocuSign agreement. So at that point, you kind of have to confront it.
It's actually interesting that the imposter syndrome kicked in during what could have been seen as success rather than failure.
Yeah, totally. Because it was almost a vindication of the concept, but it meant that I had to confront my insecurities around, me putting out content that was even relevant and almost sort of endorsed sort of the concept. But people, were, pretty much everybody, not everybody came back, but the vast majority of people that I contacted, were all in and were keen to, because I think what is interesting. I think that most people that I've come across, and it's only I'm a some case of one, but people I've come across, most people do have imposter syndrome, and regardless of whether they're CEO in a business or whether they're maybe somebody who's just joining the business, I think we all have it in some degrees, and some people are quite happy to acknowledge it. Some people might have it but not understand what it is. They might not know it's called imposter syndrome. And I think what's been quite interesting is that a lot of people that have come on the podcast, not all but a lot, they understand it and they're able to use it as fuel, because they know that if they want to achieve, you talked about a vision, if they want to achieve their vision, then controlling or managing the imposter syndrome is part of that. So you have to confront it.
It's very, what I love about this idea of with the imposter syndrome, or even when we talk about failure, is really help us to look at the mirrors, look through a mirror and see what reflection of ourselves that we get. Because as you were talking, it's obvious that whether you jump onto something and overcome the failure of jumping into it, eventually you end up with the failure of succeeding, and then the worry about succeeding, and then you worry about maybe it might not succeed, or maybe I might not have a good interview, or might not have guests, I might not have viewer. And you've also mentioned, as you were talking about starting a podcast, a lot of other podcasts out there. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is that I was speaking to is a CEO of a tech company earlier, and he's thinking about starting a podcast. So we kind of sharing advice and probably do a partnership at some point. What was quite interesting is always the perception, and he actually took me to my own journey when I was dreading starting my own podcast, thinking, what if I never get people who listen to it? What if it's rubbish? What if I can't get guests? And all the what if that goes into mind. But one way to overcome this, worry about failing, or even, that even stopped me to start, was to go back and look at podcasts from famous people. You mentioned Tom earlier, and I absolutely love Tom. Tom's podcasts are quite amazing. I love the way he thinks. We're quite aligned in that. But if you go back in his channel and channels of people that are similar, you will see that the first 2 years of the podcast, how it was low growth until eventually they picked up and then start growing. So it's my way of going against my own imposter syndrome or the negative thoughts in my mind. Is, whilst of course it's great to see all of those amazing, when you go on LinkedIn, there's always winning stories, 30 under 30s that achieved X, Y, Z, whilst there's a lot of people in their 40s or the 50s that are achieving more, but they just don't get the publicity. And it's really about this aspect of reframing, and also about knowing that it's best to start something and walk through it rather than just wait until it's perfect, because otherwise you probably won't fail, but you won't move forward either.
Yeah, totally. Because even with my podcast, where the concept does help, but if I wanted to wait to start the perfect podcast, I never have started this, because perfect doesn't. One thing that we do talk about, I'm sure we've done an episode on this, but perfect doesn't exist. You'll never, any masters, or most masters or perfectionists or masters don't consider themselves masters, because they're always looking for that next step. And I think particularly in podcasting, if you're seeking, don't wait to put out the perfect podcast. You just put content out, and you learn from every episode. So I never used to edit, but I edit now, and edit forever. But that's a great way to learn about things that I say too much, or maybe I'm talking too much, or I'm saying the same word a lot. So it's a great way to learn, and it's not something you can just apply to your podcast. You can apply it to your interactions with work colleagues or clients, or to family and friends, and you do pick up an awful lot when you start to edit. And it's been a wonderful learning curve for me as well.
Oh, definitely, and I can share that. And yes, I still cringe when I watch the first few videos I put on YouTube, and I cringe when I watch the first few episodes on my podcast. And I like to believe that a year from now I will cringe less, but at least I will be in a different mind space.
Yeah, I'm the same when I listen back to certain episodes, or because when I'm editing, I'm just like, why didn't I ask that question? Why didn't I? Because then there'll be another question I think might be more relevant, but suddenly I think, well, I should have asked that. occasionally I give myself a pat on the back, but not that often.
Yes.
Yeah.
When we look at the fear of failure
Mm.
concept, not just in startup and entrepreneurs, but from everybody, for everybody else as well, we sometimes also look at the role that family and friends can
Yeah.
play either to amplify that fear or to reduce it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, I had a really interesting guest on the podcast. It's not been published yet, but we had a conversation last week, and so I guess I've got mixed view. I think in the entrepreneurial space, particularly in the startup space, I think the challenge with um, if you have a vision and you have a passion about your whatever that may be, I think sometimes you can't always expect your family and friends to agree with that or be fully on board because their priorities might be, particularly if it's your spouse, you might be, well, I'm not sure whether this is going to back out, this idea that you've got. And, so I think it can be difficult to expect, 100% support at every decision that you make. I think it's important to find peers within your industry that maybe entrepreneurs like you can give you constructive um, feedback. Don't agree with you all the time, but if there's merit, then they do. But if there's not, then they can give you that balanced, constructive critique. But I had a guy on the podcast last week, and he um, left a lovely corporate job, decided that he wanted to be an entrepreneur, set his own startup up. That failed. He raised a bunch of money, failed in his terms, in his words. Went back to corporate, just got itchy feet again, decided actually I want another crack at corporate, at sort of his own startup. And he did that. But actually I've missed a bit out. So the first startup didn't go according to plan. Marriage suffered, first marriage suffered, and so that ended. And his second startup, I think he mentioned that he had 30, so he looked for investment before he got his first round of investment. He was rejected 38 times. On the 39th time,
Wow.
he got the investment, and he sold the business earlier on this year for over $60 million. And so for that, he I think he had family, his new wife now very supportive and so forth. But I think it's important that you have peers, maybe they're, maybe have a coach or mentor, but certainly people that are in that startup space that understand your journey, understand the extreme highs, the extreme lows, and I think that was important to him. So, he's been through every conceivable emotion that you can think of in terms of ups, in terms of the business potentially nearly going under, but then he got the opportunity to um, to have an exit this year,
Yeah.
and he's done extremely well. So, family is important, really important, but I think you need to maybe don't totally expect them to agree with every decision that you have because they may not have that same passion as you. They'll support you, but maybe they're going to think about. They might understand the business like you do as well.
Or they might also worry about you.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
sometimes it could just
Yeah.
be that they sometimes you feel that your family or your friends even
Mm,
whenever you talk to them, because I know some of my really good friends and I says, oh, but you could just stop,
mm,
especially for a big of
mm,
my company when you have all of those things that you have to put in place. But it doesn't come from a point of view of it's
mm,
not love. It's actually
mm,
too much love that they
mm,
are worried about you. They worry whether they are sleeping well, they're eating well, exercising well. But I believe, if you do have supporting family, for me, what I've seen, and I'm seeing a lot as well, is
mm,
on the times during the pandemic when things were really hard and going forward, it's nice to also have them sometimes send me random messages, like answer me one
yeah.
days ago just to cheer me up, which I thought, oh gosh, I could do with a bit of this lovely message. And I think yes, in a way, because I always try and share that message to a lot of entrepreneurs who might see that their family or their friends are not supporting. How do you change the conversation to help them understand that going through the pain you are going through is
Yeah,
bonkers, yet at the
yeah,
same time kind of the way to go to reach
yeah,
the other side.
yeah, totally. It's really difficult for family, loved ones, and friends that see you suffering, and and
Yeah.
it's difficult. I don't know, you might have a view on this. I've spoken to some
Mhm.
people who talk about wasteful failure and intelligent failure. So I know that you support and
Mhm.
work with lots of startups, and
Mhm.
you might see companies that are making the same mistake over and over again,
Yeah.
which is potentially wasteful failure. But then you've got
Mhm.
maybe more intelligent failure, which is we try something new, it doesn't work,
Mm.
but actually
Yeah.
what we've got is this new piece of information that we didn't have before. And it's like how frequently do you make the same mistake, which potentially is wasteful, and it doesn't really
Yeah.
help you. But intelligent failure potentially helps you because it gives you new information you didn't have before.
Definitely. And one very great example I have is a woman I worked with earlier this year. She's now finally starting a startup exactly the way she wanted to. But when you talk about intelligent mistakes and the one where you kind of you just
Mm,
fail and you move away from that,
mm,
she's quite young. She's an entrepreneur. She has this entrepreneurial spirit. Always worked for different companies. Very curious, and she wanted to start her business, but she didn't know exactly how do you
mm,
do that, how do you find co-founders, and a lot of those kind of things at the very beginning. She had a few ideas to go into fintech and mix it with renewable energy and or anything like that in that
mm,
sustainability space. And after spending a year of trying different ideas, working with different people, prototyping, at the end of the year she was burnt out and she felt like she failed.
mm,
I bumped into her whilst networking and she told me about what she's done. And she was completely like, I feel like I need to turn back full time employment, just stay there. But another part of me is really calling me out to go and
mm,
embrace this area of startup, which is very unclear to me, but I know I want to go there. So we started working together, and I became her advisor for a few months.
mm.
And whilst working together, the first part wasn't even about, how do you put a business together? It was really about the mindset, everything that we've talked about today in terms of how do you deal with
Yeah.
failure? How do you turn it around? How do you
Mm,
use that as a source of information? We really worked on that, trying to understand the value and unlock what she's done.
mm,
And in fact,
mm.
whilst doing that, she started remembering, oh, by the way, now I'm better at say
Yeah.
sales than I was before,
Yeah.
because of course, the first business and you're not a salesperson, it can be
Mm,
daunting. She's starting seeing a lot of the qualities that she's developed over the time. And once I got her to that point, the next question was to look at she wanted to go. And again, in this show, we talked a lot about vision, and she
mm,
always had a vision of being part of a team. She knew she didn't want to be a solo founder, so
mm,
that's okay. She knew she wanted to be in sustainability, and she knew she
mm.
wanted to maybe do some kind of fintech, but that was kind of extra. So
Yeah.
we worked with that, right? So how can we kind of create the best opportunity for you to look out there, understanding that entrepreneurship doesn't mean that you have to be the CEO, because some
Mm,
people believe
yeah.
that the only way you can run a company is
Yeah.
to be a CEO, but you don't have to. There are many roles out there, and we
Mm,
work through the roles and find what would be good for her skill set. We talked about other people, like I think Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook. She's famous, but she's never been a CEO. She's just an
mm. All right.
amazing
Really.
CEO, and that's actually great things to remind people that it's also another way of looking at entrepreneurship. And whilst we're working together, she applied for Carbon 13, which is an accelerator that helps people who want to start a business find co-founders, put together a proposition. She found co-founders that were aligned to the value that we described in terms of the area she wanted to go with. And I'm really, really excited to say that she finally, well, starting a company. She started a company and she already got pre-seed funding as well within the first less than 3 months. So you can see
Incredible.
how, when we talk about failure, she had two choices. When she got to the end of last year, she could have just gone back with
Mm,
this heavy weight of
yeah.
I failed months, which of course, we can talk about it now, but going through it is painful. And I definitely
Mm,
appreciate that. It's something that I know by
mm,
experience as well. But going through that and trying to see what have I learned and what can I move forward, and of course looking for help, people that can help you to
mm,
conceptualize, to look at things differently, to find opportunity, grow your business, and working together, she finally managed to get to the other point. And I'm very, very proud every time I see her. I'm very happy
yeah.
for her, because I know that you know when I speak to her, she's like, "Oh my God, now I've got a startup. What do I do?" I'm like, "Well,
Yeah.
you know what? A few months ago, you didn't even have one."
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's
just be
amazing. Amazing
excited
story, though.
and love that moment. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yes,
Amazing
you're right. So
story.
there is a way where intelligent failure, like you've called it, and I absolutely love the term, and I'm gonna start
Mm,
using that as well. Is a way of turning things around.
yeah. And just to add to that, something that comes up in the podcast a lot is you're probably familiar with Carol Dweck, her book Mindset. So she talks a
Hmm.
lot about growth mindset as opposed to a fixed mindset. So I think um, a lot of the high achieving entrepreneurs, and not just entrepreneurs, but you can be you can lean into other fields as well. But particularly entrepreneurs, you have this ability to not have a fixed um, tunnel vision. So if you come up against a roadblock, which 100% you will, you've got that ability to think, think openly about how you can maybe re, re sort of think about that particular problem. So I think having the growth mindset is, I think, is quite important. I think it's, and Carol Dweck's book Mindset is a great book around that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. If you don't mind sharing with us the name of the book, I would also put that on the show note
Yeah,
for anyone who's out
yeah.
there and will actually want to dive deep into this idea of the growth mindset, and just how they can get to the next step.
Yeah, certainly. So it's Carol Dweck, and the book is Mindset. So maybe we can put a link in the show
Mindset.
notes or something.
Yes, that'd be great. And talking about links, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who just experienced you and are wondering, wow, I really need to find that podcast,
Mm.
My Perfect Failure.
Yeah.
And where do I find it? And what is next for you and your podcast?
So it's on all the main directories. So Apple, Spotify. There's a website myperfectfailure.com. And I think for me, it's just you're learning, meeting people like you, inspiring people. I work with inspiring colleagues as well, but psychologists, so they've got wonderful expertise on the mind and how it works. Um, and yeah, so I just think that it's I'm just keen to meet more people, learn more, and really give people that access to a different way of viewing failure or disappointments, and view it as opportunities. Seth Godin, who's
Hmm.
you I know you all know Seth because he's a amazing
Yeah.
entrepreneur and a marketeer. He talks about, if I fail more than you, I win, because it's going back to that more information. I'm getting more information. So the more times that he comes up against roadblocks, he will think around those and come up with different solutions. And I guess in his mind, his competition, if they're playing it safe, then how can they ever go on and achieve amazing things? So if you play it safe and you don't push the edges of whatever your discipline is, potentially you're not going to hit those home runs that you want to have, which will make you sort of the pioneer of your particular space or vertical, whatever it may be.
Yeah. Brilliant. So I'll urge everybody to go and check out your podcast. And again, we're going to put the links in at the bottom of this show. Thanks again, Paul, for being wonderful. Anybody, if you have any questions, please let us know, and we will aim to answer live. At you can find me on social media, and so can
Hmm.
you. You can find Paul as well. In the meantime, let's design a happy and productive workplace playground together.
Thank you.